Okay, so in this video, I will go over the basic functions of the Tableau main program. I have already loaded in an Excel file. The process is exactly the same as in Tableau Prep, so I don't have to go over this once again. You can see once you have the data in here that there is an overview, just like in Tableau Prep. We can see our variables, and you can recognize that here I have a country data set. I have countries, I have the regions, I have the income levels of those countries, whether they are OECD or non-OECD countries, some measures for direct investment, GDP, population. I have the ECI index, which is the Economic Complexity Index of exports. I have some data on governance, quality of governance. Here's something from the World Governance Indicators, 2 variables, and you already know this data from previous videos. This is something on political constraints, and this is the Heritage Foundation data. So it's kind of a country data set with some relevant economic information for maybe decision makers in multinational enterprises and so on. So let's say we want to explore this data set. What we do first, as you know, down here, you can go to the first sheet, which is already created for you, and it opens up our measures on the left side. One of the things that I most of the time do first is to check whether Tableau has recognized all variables in the way that I want it. So that categorical variables usually appear up here, and numerical or continuous variables are down here in this measures list. If that is correct, I can basically start exploring the data. So I can think about what could be relevant to my research. Obviously, normally I would have some idea of what I want to do with the data. And so I explore this particular question. In this case, I'll just show you one simple thing that you can do. Let's say you're interested in the differences between OECD and non-OECD countries. For that, we just take the dimension OECD and non-OECD countries here, which is a categorical variable, and we can either put it into rows or columns. It doesn't really matter. I just will put it into columns right now. Here you see the table that was created. We can change these labels. If you right-click a dimension here and you click on aliases, you can actually change this if you wanted some other spelling or whatever, right? So you can do this and it is reflected here. Now, to start with something very simple, let's say we are interested in growth rates, GDP growth rates between non-OECD and OECD countries. So we pick this measure here, GDP GR, which stands for growth, and drag and drop it into rows. And this automatically opens like a bar chart in which we now see the sum of GDP growth rates. This is very important. Tableau always starts most of the time to give you like a sum of something. Whenever you drag and drop a measure into a field, it gives you the sum. When you click the small arrow to the right, you get this menu with a lot of interesting features. One is to change from sum to any other measure, okay? In this case, we're obviously interested in the average growth rate of non-OECD and OECD countries, not in the sum of the growth rates. So if we click average growth rates, what we see is that the scale on the left-hand side was adjusted to reflect growth rates, and now we see that non-OECD countries have on average a higher growth rate. Okay, so now I already know something more about the data maybe. Another thing that could be interesting is per capita GDP. Now I say, okay, let's look at those numbers because I suspect obviously here that OECD countries will have a higher GDP per capita. I again drag and drop and put it beside this other one. It opens another bar chart. Now, what we see here for the GDP per capita is once again that non-OECD countries seemingly have more, but remember this is the sum of GDP per capita. Once again, when I go to the average of GDP per capita, this looks very different. Now we see that on average, OECD countries have a much higher GDP per capita, 42,000, compared to the 8,283 of non-OECD countries. Obviously, we could now ask ourselves, why is that? Why is the sum larger than the average? Obviously, that's a very simple question. It has to do with how many countries we talk about here. One way to kind of visualize that is to use the population measure that we have here. Whenever you want to put in another variable, you have different options. So usually I use these fields here. You can just pull them in here and let Tableau do its thing and just suggest an option, but most of the time I use this marks section. So let me very briefly go through the marks section. In the first tab, you can change something which is going to be changed for all of the graphs on your page. So right now we have it on automatic, which is sparse. We could have it as anything else, squares or lines, which makes no sense, and many other things here. Let's leave it at bars for now. Then you have the color, size, label, detail, and tooltip tabs. For now, I'd like to show you the color tab, and you can experiment with the others if you want to. And I take the population and I put it into color. Now, what it does is on the right side, we get a legend with population 1 billion to 6 billion. And you see here now that the bars have been colored according to the size of the population. And obviously, we see that OECD countries house about 1 billion and non-OECD countries house about 6 billion. So this explains very clearly why our sum of GDP is larger than the average GDP when we do it like this. Another thing that we might want to do is to now say, okay, we also want to see regions in here because we're interested in how this is all distributed in regions. So we take this regions and put it beside the OECD tab into the columns. Now Tableau gives us, again, the distinction between non-OECD in these fields and OECD in these fields. And obviously it also has now is now suggesting the regions that these measures are attributed to. So in the upper left field, we have non-OECD countries and the GDP growth rate, the average. And we see that this is highest for South Asia, followed by East Asia and Pacific, and then Sub-Saharan Africa. Then we have the Middle East, North Africa, Latin America, and Europe and Central Asia. On the right-hand side, we have OECD countries, and we see that there is quite a similar growth rate. This is very different for GDP per capita. Obviously, since in Latin America, what we speak about here is Mexico, which is the OECD country that is in this data set. And on the left-hand side, you see the much smaller GDP per capita, and you also see the interesting facts that the Middle East, Europe, Central Europe and Central Asia, and Latin America, they all have relatively high GDP per capita, but relatively smaller GDP growth rates. And this is, of course, one of the ways that you can use Tableau to simply explore your data and see what is going on. Let me now show you another example. To do that, I start a new worksheet down here. And what I want to show you is a world map. If you click on Show Me, you can see Tableau can somehow do world maps. And since we have country identifiers in here, these country codes, it sees these as geographic information. This is why there is this little globe. Let's say we want to have a map of the quality of governance, but in this data set, we have several variables of the quality of governance. Let's say we wanted to have one quality of governance variable from these. The way we can do that is with cluster analysis. And to start off, we need to take our governance variables. Let's say we take the control of corruption from the WGI. We take the Heritage Foundation data, which we have, and we take, let's say, the political violence indicators of the WGI. I will change all of these quickly to averages, because that's kind of what we're concerned with here. And then I go up here to analytics. So I switch from the data tab to the analytics tab. This gives me some interesting options on what you can do. And one option is the cluster option. We see that it is grayed out right now. To access it, we first of all need to say, what do we want to cluster? Is it regions? Is it countries? So again, I take a country name and I drag this now into the field. First of all, I select all, sorry, and I drag the country name into the details field. Whenever you drag something in the details field, you tell Tableau what the level of detail is you're interested in. In this case, countries. So we drop the country names. This looks awful right now, but that doesn't matter. We go to the Analytics tab, and we now drag and drop the cluster function right here. And as we do that, this new window opens, which tells us the variables that we're trying to cluster and the number of clusters that we want to generate. Let's say now we are generating 3 clusters. We want a high governance cluster, a medium level governance cluster, and a low governance cluster. So we just use 3. And having done this, we can close this window again. We can go back to the Data tab, and we can see here the clusters that we've generated. And I can pull these clusters and drop them into the dimensions. And this will create a new group. And you can see a country name clusters. I can change the name. Let's take one of these and make a little scatter plot out of this, just so that we see the names of the clusters. Because as I was guessing, these are not really sorted well. So we have cluster 2, cluster 3, and cluster 1, which with cluster 1 being kind of the low quality cluster, cluster 3 medium, and cluster 2 high. So I go to right click and edit the group. And I click on cluster 3 and say rename and call that low and high. With this cluster data, I'm now going to generate my map. So I'm opening a new sheet and I say that I want to have this by country again. So my detail is country. And I just take the quality of governance, and as you know, we can just drag it into color. And it will color these dots in relation to our clusters that you see here. The quality of governance, medium, high, and low. And obviously, we could also change this. Now this is automatically set to these circles, which you can also change in size, maybe, which we can do in a second. But let's just switch over to normal map mode. Here you could use the quality of governance again and just have colors on the whole countries. For instance, you could do many other things. Let's just switch back to this and take quality of governance again as a color. And let's say as the size, we want population. We click on size to adjust the base size, so to say, of the circles, just to see where most people are living under what types of governance conditions. For instance, if we were interested in that, we could do something like this. And there is obviously a lot more stuff that you can do and that you can explore here. You can use your labels and label things OECD and non-OECD as well. So plenty of cool stuff.